It's another get together with my buddy Tim.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. It's a pleasure. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I was looking over some show notes that we had in the past, and this idea that you had about going from kind of the macro to the micro and kind of pivoting from the technical aspects of project management to the more human centric people aspects of I'm really enjoying what it is that we're doing. And as I understand it, we're about to start on the 12 principles that were introduced in the latest PMBOK guide from PMI.
Yeah, and you know what? I looked at a lot of the PMI training content, and they actually introduced this idea. In order for us to understand why and how people behave, we have to understand that context. And we have to understand projects and what their role in business are. We get that out of the way first, then we can actually talk about human behavior and what appropriate human behavior is, and especially not just from the team, but how we as project managers, through our actions and our attitudes, can actually shape the general success of a project.
Well, and even as I was thinking about this, when you and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking, how did we as project managers kind of get away from, maybe we didn't, but in some ways we concentrated or focused our attention on more of the technical aspects, the process aspects. And then when I think back to, say, even my childhood, I was fortunate. I grew up in a small town, a farming town where everyone was committed to, hard work and getting the crops off and all that sort of thing. But the privilege I had was that I knew all four of my grandparents, and they had come from Eastern Europe. They had homesteaded in Canada, and I got to know them and spend a lot of time. In fact, it wasn't until well into my adulthood that my grandparents began to pass away one after another. But I was thinking about that. And even as a child, I was, what's the word? Inculcated. That's a big word. But I was given the privilege of understanding that we live by principles in life. So how did we get away from that in our career path as project managers? The principle.
So I have opinions on this. They may not be right, but I have opinions. And this opinion has to do with observing thousands of students over the last 20 years. It has to do with the training we have as young people into young adults and into the business environment. We're trained to memorize, and we're trained to evaluate our knowledge by measuring how much we can recite. And that's what our exams are. They're recitations. What's the definition of this? What's the model of this? What was this author thinking? And we're repeating what we heard. Now, the problem is that's not the way project management works, and that's not the way human behavior works. Our behavior is not based on repeating previous events. It's learning from those events and learning general approaches, and somehow turning those general approaches into something that actually meets the needs of this specific problem or result. That's the trick.
You might have something there, because I even remember as a young analyst, before I became a project manager, we were introduced to Gain and Sarson. We were introduced to Jordan. We were introduced to what? Formulaic ways of going about doing our analysis. And it's as though we concentrated more on the formula than we did on the requirements or the end result that we were seeking. So I think you've got something there and then, then we went into project management, and it was all about how do I do a perfect project plan or schedule and that sort of thing. And I think you have something there.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this today, but it's not just the fault of the students. The education system found an easy way to measure, is this training working? Yes, they memorize this. They're able to repeat it. So it's a combination of human behavior and basically a system of training and education that we've had for about 80 or 90 years.
Yeah. And when I mentioned Gain, Sorsen and Jordan and all those things, I don't mean to poo-poo those things, because they were very important in terms of having some sort of systematic approach to our analysis. I think, though, as you were talking about that, the effects of causing the formula or the methodology to be as important or more important than what it was that we were trying to do, I think that's where we kind of started to get off on that track that was less principle oriented and more process oriented. So let me ask you, what do you think from your perspective and your experience, what's the importance now of establishing principles as part of our project management repository?
Okay, traditionally, what is a principle? It's an attitude that's shaped by our values that determine our behavior.
An attitude shaped by, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Shaped by our values to determine, yeah, that makes sense.
Basically, our principles are things like, I believe in spending money in the places where they create the greatest value. I believe in cleaning up as I go. I believe in keeping a half tank of gas in my car. Those are principles. Those principles are going to shape my actions and behaviors. And the principles are driven by value. My value is I value not having to walk 10 miles to get a gallon of gas. I value, getting as much out of the money I've earned because I earned it with a lot of effort. And I want the reward to be equal or more than that effort. So that's how we see this change of values to principles to behavior. Now, why is that important? Number one, as a project management, we need to understand why people behave in certain ways and how we can use that to the advantage of the project. Second of all, we have to understand that our behavior impacts the world around us, because the world, to a great extent, responds to us based on the way we behave, right? If we're greedy, the world will treat us in a like manner. If we are thrifty, if we're careful, the world will treat us in a different manner. So if we want a different world or a different experience or even a different culture in our project team, we're going to change our behavior. That's a whole concept. That's why we study things like theory X versus theory Y. That's a whole study, not about, it doesn't talk about the team's behavior. It talks about the perceptions and the principles and the attitudes of project managers and how they shape the project's results.
So when we start to understand human behavior, I can see that being very effective on projects because our teams behave one way, our client organizations behave one way, our peers behave one way, our superiors behave one way. So there's a lot of human behaviors that we have to kind of understand and be able to respond to as we go about our daily business of managing the project.
Yeah, and there's so much more complexity to this. And this is where I want to take this conversation. Why don't we study these things early in our career development? It's funny. I bring this up to all my students. My students always start with schedule, cost, scope, risk, quality, right? And they start off with that. And then all of a sudden they either master it or they get bored with it, or they want to see something more out of project management. And that's when they start looking at these things like principles and other behavioral factors.
I was smiling because I think we've talked about this in different ways before, and we may have already alluded it to earlier in this presentation, but I think the reason we don't spend time is because we as a society, as a culture, especially in the West, we like to have our facts and figures and processes and schedules and arts and charts and wall art and all that stuff out of the way first. So I think what we do is we train our project managers to become skilled at the technical aspects of managing projects. And, in terms of getting them to understand that and develop that as a strength or a skill, we somehow leave off for later, perhaps, or maybe forget about it altogether, is the people skills, the soft skills of what it is that we need to be as leaders.
You said an important word just there, soft. I have a theory. That, historically calling them soft skills have actually lowered the perceived value of these skills in a lot of the eyes, because again, it's not actual.
Yeah.
It's not facts. It's not measurable or achievable. It's soft. It's emotional. And a lot of these things we believe get in the way of projects. They take up time, and we don't realize the value of understanding these until much later.
Well, and I can see that because I can measure you if I look at the word hard skill, in terms of you as a project manager developing a project schedule for a 3-year project. I can measure your success based on the detail that you put into that project, and therefore I can touch it, feel it, see it, I can visualize it. But if I say, how do I understand your communication skills? That becomes more intangible. And so you're right. I think soft skills, by calling them soft skills, we lower their perception because we can't touch and feel. I mean, my perception of your communication skills may be completely different than someone else's perception of your communication skills.
There's another factor that comes into these principles and human behavior topics. They're complex. It takes time to basically pull out all the pieces, and they're interconnected in weird ways. And there's a lot of ambiguity, not just ambiguity, but diversity when you start looking at individual group behavior, because you're talking about nature versus nurture. It's also driven by our values, which drive our principles, which are driven our behavior. And so when we look at this incredible soup, it's very hard for us to grasp this at first notice.
Well, even think about it, what you're just talking about in terms of complexity and ambiguity. Think of individual A, and that person and I are having a coffee. That person may behave one way, but then I bring the whole team together, and person A is part of my team. And in the larger confine of the group, that person behaves completely differently. Now, if I were not an astute project manager, I might wonder, that might throw me off. But if I understand human behavior and some of those soft skill approaches, I can understand why that person worked with me one way when we were one-on-one versus in the group. Complex and ambiguous. I think that's the terms you use.
Here's the weird thing. We're going to be talking about a lot of principles, right? There's 12 principles that are documented in the body of knowledge, right? There may be other principles we might want to bring on to discuss as well. But there's a little piece in the body of knowledge that says something very interesting. It says, maybe perhaps this is a standard not just for project managers. Maybe this standard is for everyone. Now, and again, let's would you care to comment on that first?
So not just for project managers, but for the entire, I'm going to include in my definition of team, the persons that I'm serving as my clients, as well as the persons I'm serving as a project manager who are developing the project to be implemented. That makes sense, because if we don't align along these principles, I can see utter chaos happening on the project, where where if you and I are on the same team and you have one vision and I have a different one, and we don't align along some of these 12 principles, I can see the chaos beginning to start on the project itself.
Let's actually pull up an example so we can talk about this more concretely. Stewardship. Let's actually start exploring this as an example of stewardship. What's your definition of stewardship as a principle?
Well, if I take a strict definition, like say a dictionary definition, it's sort of me as someone who is managing responsibly, carefully, something that's been entrusted to me, to my care, or to my to the well-being of the overall group. That would be from a kind of a dictionary. So I am the steward of someone else's assets or something that they put in front of me to take care of for them. Yeah. But I bet PMBOK has its own stewardship definition.
It actually expounds on that. That's the core. That's the kernel. Okay. Being entrusted with the care. They actually go beyond that, saying responsible planning, use, and management of resources, and upholding values and ethics. So stewardship connects back to values and ethics, something I hold in high regard, my values, and my consideration of right or wrong, my ethics.
So if we're doing our job right as project managers, we are carrying out those activities that have been entrusted to us as project managers with care, with integrity, with trustworthiness, with based on a code of ethics. And PMI does have a code of ethics. So all of that kind of fits into what I do as a project manager if I'm upholding the principle of stewardship.
So you and I agree. As a project manager, this is a principle that is a hallmark of what we call a mature project manager. Now, let's go back to the question. Could we say that's also a principle of value for anybody on the team or any stakeholder or anybody who's influenced by the project?
Oh, if you put it that way, Tim, I would absolutely say yes.
Yeah.
I'm even thinking back to my own experience as a young analyst. I cared as much about the product I was delivering for the client as my project manager did. And so therefore, that client entrusted even in me as a lowly analyst or a developer. And I shouldn't say lowly, I shouldn't have used the word lowly, but as a person who is less in charge of, say, the project itself, I cared about as much of what I delivered from a quality perspective and from what they expected of me as the project manager did.
Yeah. And again, this actually leads us to two characteristics of self-awareness that are needed in a successful project, both from a project manager standpoint and a team and stakeholder. We have responsibility where nobody has to tell me to start working. And we have accountability, which means I care about the result. I am a steward. I want the experience to be as good as possible. I want this to be better than what we expected at the beginning. And if I can have everybody on the team and the stakeholders having that same attitude, I know I'm going to get a better result.
So that almost takes me back to our discussion on soft skills. And we've said this before, even on this podcast, that what has come into my purview is the fact that the soft skills really are the hard skills.
Yeah, they're the difficult skills. Yeah.
But if we develop those soft skills, for example, the ability to adapt, strong leadership skills, and just because you are a member of the team as opposed to the leader of the team doesn't mean that you can't exhibit leadership qualities. And so all of those soft skills that we're talking about, critical thinking, strong work ethic, good communication skills, all of those fit into what we're talking about in terms of being good stewards. of what the client or the organization has entrusted in me.
Yes. Yes, indeed. And this is the key. When we're talking about these skills, we're not just talking about skills that make us a very effective project manager, but it makes us a very effective sponsor or stakeholder or product owner, whatever we want to call that. That's the beautiful part of this. Now, here's the thing. When we actually look about stewardship, it sounds almost like servant leadership, doesn't it?
Well, I can see the connection, but I can see differences as well.
Yes, yes. Let's review what we consider as servant leadership. Let's not go to the definitions, but let's just agree what we mean by a servant leader. Do you have a quick narrative description of a servant leader?
Well, if I recall, there's a person by the name of Greenleaf. That's what it was. I'm going back, way back in the annals of my historical thinking here. But he talked about a servant leader as one who has the want or the need to serve. Even in a leadership capacity, it's one who wants to serve. That is sort of an outward expression of a natural feeling towards others.
Yeah, and Greenleaf's important because he was an expert that actually used the term servant leader and servant leadership in his books almost before everybody else was. It was becoming a common phrase, but he was the first published author that actually was starting to define this idea. That's a good definition. The one that I look at is number 2, understanding and addressing the needs of the people. Right? Understanding people, first of all, and number 2, in order to help them do better work. It's basically clearing the ground of the distractions and giving people what they need. It's almost like being a good farmer.
So now you're entering my territory as a farm boy. But that natural feeling of wanting to serve, there's a natural extension that as a result of that, you primarily focus on the growth of your team, even on the growth of your client team. So again, it's an outward expression, which I think is part of what we talked about in stewardship, but I think stewardship also has a different connotation.
Yes, stewardship is the principle, and servant leadership is the expression of stewardship, among other principles. And that's how I look at it.
Maybe that's where I was going with stewardship being kind of the outward expression of wanting to serve, servant leadership being the outward expression of wanting to serve, whereas the servant leadership is more inward focused in terms of, I need to do this so I can serve better. I need to contain this particular part of my personality so I can serve better.
There you go. There you go. Principles and behavior.
Yeah.
I connect this to who I am and how I behave. And that's what stewardship talks about, where servant leadership are the actions that actually take that into its expression. Very good. Very good. Very good.
So if I can just digress here a little bit.
Please
This is much more fun than talking about a schedule that goes out for 3 years with predecessors and successors and resource alignment.
Well, you know what? It actually is more complex and it's difficult and it takes more time, but you're right. It has incredibly more value and it has incredibly more influence on how we can actually help a project become more successful. That's the key. And again, I'm going to go back to our initial, discussion around soft skills. To call them soft is almost to denigrate what they truly are. They're, like you said, they're hard, they're complex. I like PMI's word of power skills, but I don't think that actually puts them in the right light either.
No, in fact, and again, we talked about how we are outward focused in our approach to people. Some of my soft skills may be well accepted by some of my team. Some may be not accepted as well. And again, we have to understand how we're coming across to others.
Yes, yes. And this is where we pull in our other leadership skills, like self-awareness and emotional intelligence, how to read a room, how to read individuals and groups. And also, that is a component of stewardship.
So it's almost like someone asked my dad one time, I have 3 brothers, so there's 4 of us. Someone asked my dad, well, do you treat them all equally? And my dad's response was, I treat them all equally, but not the same.
Yes.
Because each of us had our own personalities, each of us had our own foibles, each of us had our own strengths. And so as a result of that, he had to kind of nurture us according to how we were developing, not according to how he wanted each of us to develop.
And how he liked to be a parent. This is, and again, number one, this is a big moment of truth when you become a parent. You know, I like to do this with my kids, but because of what my child needs right this moment, I have to do things I don't like. Now, that is exactly the experience we have as a project manager. This is not the way I like to manage the project, but this is what I have to do because this needs something more than what I like. I have to be entrusted to care for it, not my opinions, not my perception, but what it is. We're getting to that, we're getting to that user-centered design. We're getting to that stakeholder focus, the voice of the customer again. Stewardship actually says there is going to be sacrifice. There is going to be something that says I have to put aside my opinions and attitudes in order to get this done.
And yet, even in all of that, and I'm going to add to that complexity. Even in all of that, we still have a requirement to influence. So where I need to perhaps dampen down my opinion or my approach to something, I still have to be able to influence my team so that we do deliver a good product on time, within budget, and according to client satisfaction.
Yes. This is spinning plates.
Yeah.
And again, it's not just spinning plates where you have scope, schedule, cost, risk, and quality. We're also realizing there's people helping us spin plates. And we have a couple guys over in the corner fighting. We have somebody else who actually is reading their smartphone. And how can we get them to actually, number one, understand the value of keeping all the plates spinning, and number two, participate in the plate spinning where they can actually do a really good job.
Well, and going back to an earlier discussion where these really are the hard, complex, ambiguous skills, those 2 guys who are fighting or contending in the corner, I can't put that on a project plan. My project plan says I will do this within 2 weeks, and it doesn't allow for people contending with each other.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Because our tools are great, but they measure these indicators that oftentimes don't consider behavior. That some of them do, actually. Some of them do, like Parkinson's law. Parkinson's law is fun. It says that the work will grow to consume all available time. Basically, what it says is if you give your team 2 hours to do an hour and a half job, it's going to give them 2 hours. Now, you can actually schedule that out by setting it for an hour and a half and have 15 to 20 minutes built in as schedule reserve, right? Yeah. You can't quantify these behavioral things, but it's not the behavior. It's the result of the behavior that you're scheduling that gets this really on the schedule. But you're right. You're right. When we talk about schedule and quality and risk, these behavioral things are sort of amorphous, and it's very hard to quantify them.
Can we describe them? Can we, for our audience, do you think we can kind of describe some of the perhaps actions or those sorts of things that a good steward project manager can take on the team to show that they're good stewards and that they can increase the understanding of what's required?
Why don't you start? I have 1,000 in my head right now, but why don't you start?
Well, one of the things that I like to talk about a lot is before I ask my team to do anything, I have to be able to exhibit the same commitment. And so when I was managing projects, one of my requirements of myself was that when my team came in to the office in the morning, I was already there. When my team was putting on their coats to leave in the evening, I was still at my desk. Not that I wanted to be there all that time, because there was times I didn't have to be, but what it did was it showed my team that as I asked them to put in the extra effort, perhaps they could see that I too was putting in the extra effort. And so therefore I was not hypocritical in my approach. So I think that's one approach right there in terms of an action that I can represent good stewardship of time, of effort, of quality, and of just faithfulness to the project.
You know, that leading by example is really important. I had the same thing. I don't usually talk about this, but I would always notice in a lot of my technical projects that my team was always jumping to conclusions and jumping right into the work and starting to do this, and they, without really having a real grasp of what they were doing, and there was no discussion of risk or anything. It was like, man, come on, guys, what are you doing? Slow down, until one day I started looking at myself and said, where are they learning how to just jump into the work? And I realized I was doing the same thing. And so what I had to do was, before I tell my team that they're going to do it, I'm going to have to be able to do it myself. And lo and behold, as I started telling myself, push the brakes, relax, take a sip of coffee, all of a sudden, my team started relaxing a little bit too. It was really funny. I remember this the first time, and then I started trying it on more and more projects. And now a lot of my teams, when I finished with the kickoff, the team is starting to look for me to basically pick up a cup of coffee, sit back and go,
Well, and that's important. I found sometimes at a 10-minute recess with putting your feet up on your desk is not a bad way to kind of reset, rethink. And I've actually had situations like that where a member of my team may come into my office, put their feet up on my desk, have a conversation, and all of a sudden a light bulb goes on.
Right. Business by nature embraces urgency. It has to, because we have to go to market sooner. We have to get profit earlier and all those things, right? And so in that environment, we almost have to give ourselves and our team members permission to grant a little bit of that space. And that's where servant leadership and stewardship are actually helping us with that.
Well, and I remember too, and you may remember this, you worked for a large manufacturer, but I remember this situation where when we went to something called flex hours. Now, I was used to being not a 9 to 5er, but probably a 7 to 7er typically. But when I had some of my team coming in at 9, some coming in at 10, some coming, and I'm thinking, this is not working for me. But we hear what that said? This is not working for me.
Right.
When I understood it and understood how people's work, some people were morning people and they were in at 7 at the same time I was. Some people preferred to work much later into the evening. And there'd be times that I knew that people were sending me emails at midnight, but that was their work effort. Now, here's the thing. I had to understand that flex hours I could use for the benefit of the project, not be judgmental of those people who couldn't be in the morning, but use those hours to benefit the entire team. And so we set up, say core hours from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Everyone was in during that time. Otherwise, you guys are on your own, do your work. But the whole idea was, let's have a core team and let's get our work done. And it worked.
I had a management mentor that actually gave me that idea too. He said, Tim, what would happen if we stopped measuring performance by time cards?
Yes.
And we started managing the team by results.
Yeah.
What would that look like?
And that's where the example I just gave you, I had to move my own perceptions from one of lacking in punctuality, which is kind of how it first came across, to one exactly what you were just talking about, measuring results.
And you know what? We think this is complex and a bit ambiguous. And we think that it's, with soft skills and all that, we think that these things are not measurable, but this is getting into the whole discussion of key performance indicators, which are the critical indicators of project success. And we have to say, what does a successful project look like? And maybe it is not being in our chairs from 8 to 5. Maybe it is actually progress on the scope and on the schedule, no matter how much time it takes.
Well, and let me give you a very practical example in terms of being stewards of our time. We had a habit in the company I worked for at one time of having a meeting to discuss things. Let's do a 15-minute meeting. Let's do a 30-minute meeting. Let's do a 45-minute, whatever it was, right? Till I had a new manager came in and he said, I don't need a meeting, just send me an email. A 3-minute email saved an hour meeting. And suddenly I had a whole bunch of time left over because what? We wasted time in meetings. So to be a steward of our clients' time, of our organization's time, we need to be thinking in these terms all the time.
This triggers an old memory of mine. When they went from the 4th edition of the PMBOK to the 5th, they stopped calling it time management and they started calling it schedule management. First of all, we don't manage time, we manage schedule.
That's true.
Second of all, the indicator is not how long it takes, but actually it's the activities, it's the level of effort that's completed. Now, we measure progress using time with our duration and with our, rate of progress and that kind of thing. But time is just one factor that we use in measuring the movement of the project forward.
Well, and that makes sense. I remember a situation where I had a team member say, you know what, I'm taking the afternoon off. My little sister's in a gymnastics meet. I want to go watch her in her gymnastics meet. My first inclination was, but you haven't got your 8 hours in today. But my second inclination was, knowing this person, she was already ahead of schedule on her tasks. And it was like, yeah, we're managing. What did you just say? Managing the schedule, not managing time. And again, not managing by punch card, but managing by results. And I said, you know what? You go enjoy your sister's gymnastics meet. And why don't you take some flowers from me when she's finished her particular event? Easy peasy.
Well, and you know what? This makes total sense, because this is not just, an aha that Tim and Merv are having here. This is actually has incredible ramifications in the times we live within. Because when you and I were born, we were born in the post-industrial age, where you measure things by punching a card or pulling a switch or something like that, right? Now, we're in the information age now, which means we're in the age of creators, of knowledge, And a creative is just like what you talked about a few minutes ago. A creative said, I'm stuck. Let me do a round of golf, clear my head. And somehow around the fifth hole, all of a sudden a brainstorm happens.
Yeah.
And I cannot put a duration around that, but I can put basically a milestone, as well as put an event that said I did work.
Yeah, and you had mentioned, in terms of the creative age, but even with that, I remember even from my farm boy days, if the harvest had to come in before the bad weather came, then you did work around the clock. You had to do what you had to do. Otherwise, your entire industrial product was wasted, right?
Right.
But it's an amazing thing that spending 11 hours, 15 hours on a tractor pulling a combine, and all of that thinking time, how much creativity came as a result of that. So even though we were harried and hurried in what it was that we had to do, at the same time, there was that stillness that allowed us to be creative.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? So we have these behavioral components on one side, and we have these functional components on the other side. And it's starting to sound like they're part of the same coin. It's just, heads and tails, but they're both necessary for the coin to exist.
Well, and I think the other thing is, if we really do pay, and we're going to spend the next several shows on these principles, today's stewardship, and when we really think of these principles and stewardship in particular, I think for myself, in my own experience, the principle of stewardship and delivering what my client entrusted to me was one of those events that changed me from being a technical project manager to being more holistic in my project management approach.
Yeah, it's more when you say holistic, I think integration and I think strategic too. This was when my aha happened. It was basically, hey, I'm no longer managing the individual actions. I'm working at the strategic level. And it's not just maturing as a project manager, but it's maturing as a leader too.
Well, you just said something there. When I started managing at the strategic level, I got invited to the big table more often.
It's a natural occurrence. When you start looking at these principles and you start understanding them and you start demonstrating them, people notice. People do notice.
And people ask your opinion.
Indeed. So let's actually pivot to one last question here. If I want to be, let's say I'm a young project manager and I'm tired of just getting my schedule and my budget and my resources in place and just doing the project day after day. How can I start playing with these concepts of stewardship in order? What type of experiments can I do, and what type of actions can I take to actually seeing what stewardship feels like from a project management standpoint?
Well, assuming that this is a fairly new concept to me as a new project manager, I'm going to go first of all and do some reading and try to really understand, what does stewardship mean? Perhaps not just as a project manager, but in life in general. And when I understand the outward focus of my ability to help someone, especially understanding that they've entrusted something to me, when I start to understand that, then I begin to look for areas that I can anticipate my client's issues, that I can anticipate my client's questions. And so therefore begin to work on those soft skills, those listening skills, those understanding skills, those behavioral skills that will bring me to the table more often.
Yeah. And again, it's changing the way you're perceiving the data. You're still collecting the same data, but you're looking at it through the lens of, again, this principle, this idea that I have genuine concern over something. Something's been given to me. And you're right. We don't have to limit this to project management. The beautiful thing about these behavioral actions, we can take them outside of our project activities and apply them to other parts of the organization or our work. And even we can take it to our personal lives too. We can start looking at, okay, what does this mean? This is what it means in project management. But if I really want to understand it, what does this mean about my salary? What does this mean about the dinner I'm making? What does this mean about the family I'm caring for? And how does stewardship change my perception of the values of these things in my actions?
And so as a young person, I don't want to ever give up on the skills I've learned on the technical and process side. I still want to be very good at those things. But you asked, what can I do as a young person in terms of enhancing my skills? I think exactly what you and I are saying is, don't leave those good ones behind that we have already learned, but begin to practice. I've had situations where, for example, one of the project directors, very senior people for my client organization, needed to write a funding memo to get more funds for the project. And I volunteered to write the funding memo for her from the perspective of what was happening in the project and how that could enhance what she needed the funds for.
Yeah, and you're right. It's not going through just the mechanical actions of doing things. It's actually doing these things responsibly. Now, responsible for you and responsible for the way your organization and your environment looks at it, upholding values and ethics, and taking these definitions and deconstructing them and say, what does this definition do to change my perception, not just the actions I do, but how I approach these actions?
Another thing that I would do as a young project manager, we're big these days on lessons learned. How could I have done that better on the schedule? How about if we look at lessons learned in terms of how should I have behaved in that meeting? How could I have gone to my client's rescue in this situation? If this happens again, how will I react differently than I did the last time? So I think lessons learned is more than just the practical, technical, process-oriented lessons. I think it's everywhere.
Well, yeah, exactly. Again, what we're talking about with these things is they are a lens. They help us focus in different areas. And what we're going to learn is this stewardship can actually help us focus in on everything. The way we work with our team, the way we work with our stakeholders, the way we approach risk, the way we approach quality, the way we approach planning, the way we choose. Should this really be a more adaptive approach? Should this really be a traditional project? All of these things actually can be influenced by this principle.
You and I had a conversation the other day, and you used a term that I really like called a behavioral toolkit. Does that fit here, Tim, in your mind? Does that fit in the discussion we're having?
Yes. And this is what I'm alluding to. I would love to be able to have a project manager that is just getting to the point where they're confident with their scheduling and with their risk and their other things, and be able to hand them a set of tools that get them on the road to the right attitude and principles and behaviors. I don't think that just giving people actions, whether they're a project manager or a team member or something, actually does anybody a service. It gets them started. But what people really need is why. They need a reason why. They need context. They need purpose. And the toolkit, the behavioral toolkit would actually have to be that context and purpose. Like what we're talking about, stewardship. What's its value? How do we use it? And in what applications can we use it? We can't just say, you know, here's a screwdriver, here's a stewardship, go forth and prosper. Here's the definition. We can't do that anymore. What we have to do is give something that actually has a little more detail around it.
Exactly. And the why, I was just going to say the why, and you stole it from me. But, you know, I find that even for myself. And so clearly my team members would find the same thing, is if they know the why, leave the mechanics up to them, get the obstacles out of their way, give them the ability to creatively solve the problem on their own once they know the end result and why they're doing it. I think that just makes for a much more well-rounded team and more productivity.
Oh yeah. And again, it's been demonstrated that if everybody understands the purpose of going through an action and how it fits in with the big vision and how it connects to their values, if they understand that, they're always going to give a better result.
Absolutely. Well, in the interest of being good stewards of time, is this a good place to wrap up?
I think it is. I think it is.
We have had a great discussion on this. I even learned a few things, and I thought I was a good steward already.
You know, and I'm looking forward to looking through the next 11 items, and let's actually start talking about a behavioral toolbox that we can start building on. I think there's something there.
There is, yeah. Good stuff. All right. Until next week.
Yes. Looking forward to another conversation. Thanks again.